Thank you, and welcome to the ZWAC Show, the Zero Waste Advocacy Committee of the Northern California Recycling Association. Every month, we try to talk about something new and interesting, as well as something old. I'm going to start with the something old tonight. Um, just a few days ago, Kathy Evans, who was a longtime NCRA supporter, former board member, passed away. And we weren't able to publicize this in the way that we wanted to. But at 6 o'clock, we're going to have an recycling archives segment about Kathy. So if you could alert your networks that we're going to be doing that at 6 o'clock, I'd appreciate it. It'll be well worth it. For tonight, my guest interviewer is Baani Behniwal, who is with the Climate Center. We're going to find out what the Climate Center does and what she does. The genesis for that is this is a 60-minute show that I watched months ago, and I try to look out for things that are new and interesting. And I found that the governor of Wyoming is touting a lot of things that he views as, environmental technologies. And the show featured some of them. And one of them was a system that purported to capture carbon dioxide that was being emitted and compress it and put it in some sort of storage vehicle and bury it. And I found out that there are multiple carbon capture systems out there. And so I looked around for someone who might be able to talk about it, because I wasn't so sure in zero waste principles whether burying anything was a good idea. So I looked around and had help from Nick Lapis of CAW, and he put me in touch with Baani. And she's agreed to talk tonight about the different carbon capture technologies, one of which was featured in the 60-minute show. And what I was struck about from the governor of Wyoming was his statement that, there are a lot of things that would be nice to be able to do environmentally, but we ought to try to figure out what we can do now. And that kind of resonated with me, but I'm not sure that what the oil and gas lobby wants to do now is what I would like to do now. So, Baani, turning to you, and you're muted still. First of all, let's talk about you and the Climate Center. Tell us about what the Climate Center does and where it's located.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you everyone so much for having me tonight. So the Climate Center is a nonprofit advocacy organization working to scale up climate policy starting off here in California to ensure that we are meeting our climate goals in accordance to science and not just what state policy or federal policy states. And so we work primarily on three different issues within climate. One is the phasing out of polluting fuels, so cutting off direct emissions. Second is deploying clean energy. And third is carbon drawdown. So to get to net zero, we not only have to reduce emissions, but we have to draw down existing atmospheric emissions. So that is my focus here at the Climate Center. And historically, we have focused primarily on nature-based solutions to provide those negative emissions through photosynthesis, plants and soils, sequester carbon and store them. However, the latest science is showing that nature-based solutions won't get us to where we need to in time. We have simply gone too far, emitted too much into the atmosphere, that we need to look beyond the natural carbon cycle and into other strategies. So we are exploring those, and that is what I'm happy to talk to you about today.
And in fact, I think your job title is Carbon Drawdown Director. Am I right?
Yes, that is correct.
So within those non-natural carbon drawdown solutions, what do you work on?
Well, so we're really just starting to explore what the different strategies are and which ones are viable, which ones can actually be deployed responsibly. Now, I do want to be very clear about definitions here because they matter. So I believe the segment that you had watched, John, which was the impetus for this conversation, was about CCS, or carbon capture and storage. It's also referred to as carbon capture utilization and storage, so CCUS. And this is a technology that is put on top of a smokestack, so say at a refinery, and it is essentially a filter which is meant to capture the carbon before it enters into the atmosphere. And then you have to figure out what to do with that carbon once it's captured. Now, the types of strategies that we work on are on carbon removal. So this is removing carbon that's already been emitted into the atmosphere. And those strategies, they range from nature-based solutions, like I talked about, everything from regenerative agriculture to forestry and wetland conservation, to some of the ones that are considered, somewhat natural, somewhat engineered, such as the production of biochar or enhanced mineralization. And then you have different strategies that are more strictly technological, such as direct air capture or, bikers, biomass with carbon removal and storage, which are technologies that, capture the carbon from the ambient air and then store that carbon somewhere. So in the carbon dioxide or CDR world, there's a whole slew of strategies. A few of them, the technological ones, do have some overlap with CCS in that they capture carbon in a stream and have to manage that carbon. So that Venn diagram, the middle part is the carbon management. So the storage of the carbon and the transportation of the carbon. But I do want to make that distinction because they have very different implications for how, policy addresses those two different pools of carbon. One is future carbon emissions, and the other is past carbon emissions. And the incentives that we will utilize for them should be very differently because one of them, more obviously allows for the oil and gas industry to continue business as usual with the promise that it'll capture the carbon before it escapes into the atmosphere. And the other one is dealing with the very real reality that we are at around 420 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere right now, far beyond what a safe level is of 350 parts per million.
So before I get into asking you about some of those things, I always like to ask people on the show, how in the world did you get here? What was your journey to becoming the Carbon Drawdown Director?
That's a great question. I became interested in environmental work at towards the end of college. I did a trip abroad in which I was exposed to the idea of permaculture, and I went and worked on several farms, learning about regenerative agriculture, which eventually led me to receiving a master's in global environmental policy with a focus on sustainable agriculture. Then I got my first policy gig at CAW, where I met Nick Lapis, and I worked with NCRA quite a bit. I have been to one of your conferences, and then I eventually came to the Climate Center, where I continued to do agricultural related policy, but now it's expanded to carbon removal more broadly.
Well, it's nice to find a career that you can be passionate about. I am passionate about being a lawyer, so I respect that. But going back to these different technologies, and believe me, we know that words matter, and there's a lot of greenwashing out there. But when I hear what you said, I'm thinking, well, of course we need to reduce carbon emissions in the future, but we also have a problem right now. And what does it really matter how we get the existing carbon out of the air right now? If we
Sorry, I didn't understand the question there.
what if if we have technologies that get the carbon out of the air, what's wrong with using them? Are there some that you think as a matter of policy are worse than others, and why?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly need to use all of the tools that we can in the climate toolbox. However, some of them have different implications for health and safety, right?
Okay,
So some of the I'm not talking about CCS. I'm not talking about the filters on the smokestacks that are preventing future emissions, but
right,
rather the technologies that are drawing down existing carbon, atmospheric carbon. So
right,
within those strategies, the carbon dioxide removal industry writ large is pretty new, right? Of course, natural processes have been going on since long before any of us were here.
right,
That's not new. A lot of land management strategies, such as The use of compost, for example, is nothing new. But a lot of strategies, such as direct air capture, for example, are more nascent. And and then there are strategies that I haven't even talked about yet, such as marine carbon removal, which can include, ocean alkalinity enhancement, artificial upwelling, downwelling. There's tons of strategies out there, and they're all in different phases of research and development. So we're not exactly sure what deploying these strategies at scale, what kind of impact they might have. So, for example, if you're increasing alkalinity in the ocean, it sounds like a good idea, right? We expand the amount of CO2 that it could then sequester, and which also addresses the ocean acidification issue. However, what are the broader implications of increased alkalinity on marine life? So there's a lot of questions around not only what are the implications, what is the cost, who is paying for it, and what are the other gaps of research that we just don't know that we don't know yet, right? So with direct air capture, I would say one of the big questions that we're thinking about, especially as there are more and more incentives to increase this strategy, is how can we safely transport the carbon, right? We can't use existing pipelines, and if there is a leak, CO2 is an invisible gas. And it's hard to detect. And there has already been at least one incident in which there was a leakage in Mississippi, and it caused several hospitalizations. So, with any new industry, we have to ensure that there are safeguards before it is deployed on a massive scale.
So I see what you're saying. And of course, it's quite a conundrum. You have a problem you'd like to fix, but is the solution going to be more harm than good? I think of all the times where we've messed with Mother Nature to, for example, introduce a species into an environment that ended up being a lot more trouble than it was worth. The introduction of mongoose into Hawaii, for example, which savaged the native bird population. How do you study in the broad scheme of things? How do you study whether something is safely safe enough to use?
Well, luckily, I don't have to do that research, right? There are tons of academics and institutions and even companies that are doing a lot of this research. We are simply trying to figure out, what are the policies that are needed to, one, incentivize the good carbon removal strategies,
Mhm.
and how can we ensure that there are safeguards to prevent the worst outcomes like you talked about. There are tons of resources out there to learn about every type of carbon removal strategy, as well as what kinds of policies are already in place, outside of California, in different states, in different countries. Um, this is a newer industry that there is a lot of energy behind, and there's a lot of live conversation that's happening. Now, I would say, on a higher level, the best strategy, in my opinion, would be to have a portfolio approach. Every strategy, even the more innocuous nature-based solutions, strategies, they have their pros and cons, right? So when you think of the most obvious example that comes to mind is planting a tree to remove existing carbon.
Mhm.
However, that tree has a limited life. Once it dies, a lot of that carbon will be re-emitted into the atmosphere. Or in the case of wildfires, which ironically enough, we have they are even more prevalent and more catastrophic with climate change. All of that CO2 that's been stored in those forests over hundreds of thousands of years can then be re-emitted. So that is a huge downfall of nature-based solutions, that they are not considered permanent. And at the same time, other strategies such as direct air capture, which requires either utilization of that carbon or storage, so underground geologic formations, that there has been geologic sequestration that's been happening for at least 2 decades now, but it just hasn't happened at the scale that we know it's needed. It's a very, very small fraction, so we are just unsure of what those ramifications can be. So that's obviously it's permanent, but it's a huge con in that there might be leakage, there might be seismic activity, there's other issues to
So it
consider.
sounds like you kind of study what other people have studied and try to vet it so that you can properly advise policymakers about the pros and cons. So, for example, in solid waste management, the idea for many, many years was bury it in a landfill, or even better, burn it and make some energy from it. In our recycling industry, we've found that these things have a lot of negatives. It took a long time to convince policymakers that the negatives outweighed the benefits, and a huge struggle to define zero waste, for example, to be no burn or bury. So, given that kind of level of difficulty, how do you sort through all this studying stuff and the advocacy and the lobbying that goes on? How do you find the sweet spot to advise the policy deciders?
Well, I really consider my job, and really what the Climate Center is really good at doing is bringing together experts to have these kinds of critical discussions. So we hosted a webinar series on carbon dioxide removal. We're actually having our sixth and final installment of that webinar series at the end of this month. But the whole idea there is there are so many unanswered questions, right? There's a lot of differing opinions on those questions. So we want to bring together experts and have those conversations together and ask some of these questions. And really, at the end of the day, when it comes to any type of science or policy, even, there's going to be a limited amount of information that you're working with. So you do the best that you can and just try to make sure that there are safeguards in the worst case scenario.
So, if I were, a assembly person in the state of California, you might invite me to one of your seminars where I could hear these different viewpoints. But ultimately, I've got to make a decision as a policymaker. And I'm hearing lots of different options, and I'm hearing these things, but I need someone to tell me what's right. Or I'm just going to call the governor of Wyoming and say what works for you. So how do I know as the policymaker what the right policy is, and how can you help me find it?
Well, I would say that these types of issues that are a lot more granular and require scientific expertise, it is, I see it as the job of the legislature to come up with some sort of framework, but then have that the rulemaking or the regulations happen at the state agency level. And those are the types of policies that we're seeing, right? So for example, there is a bill right now in the legislature by Senator Becker, SB 285, which seeks to set standards for carbon dioxide removal. So the standards are it has to be at least the durability has to be for at least 100 years. It has to include certain community safeguards. It cannot be used to replace direct emission reductions. Those kinds of framework concepts that can then be taken to the state agency and through a regulatory process in which there are experts that are engaged in those conversations and providing public comment. Advocates are providing public comment. Industries providing public comment. All of those questions get sorted out in that setting rather than in the legislature. So I would say it's that is really the role, is to create different incentives or frameworks, but the legislature can't really say we choose this strategy over that strategy.
Well, that's that's a nice sounding framework, but then I start thinking about SB 54, a very nice recycling bill. a process that was the legislature gave to the regulatory people to set up rules to implement it, which they did with a lot of input from stakeholders. And all of a sudden, a political person in our state decided for political reasons to just undo it all.
Yeah.
So at some point, if I'm the policymaker, I need to be told what to do. If I'm the governor, I need to be told whether to keep SB 54 or not. How do you deliver the message? There has to be a right and wrong for a decision maker. There has to be a policy to follow. You can't give them too much, can you?
Well, I mean, the SP54 example
I'm
is
not trying to either. I'm just
very unfortunate. The recent news, I was quite dismayed to hear that. Um, John, that's it. I don't think I have an answer for you. I don't think it's that black and white. And I think for carbon removal specifically, it is best suited for us to think about what are what is the proper role that it plays in climate policy, and set high quality standards for what safe deployment looks like to ensure that there are not any perverse incentives, for example, for industry. So, say, an oil company to buy a bunch of carbon removal credits and say, we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, right? We have to ensure that those are segregated. So, CDR is not boxing out direct emission reductions. So, I think those kinds of issues can be dealt with at the legislature level, but it is not up to legislators, in my opinion, to choose the winners and losers of carbon removal. It is such a evolving industry, and there are new strategies coming out all the time. So maybe the best strategy that we have for removing carbon out of the atmosphere hasn't even been invented yet, right? I don't think it's the place to choose the winners and losers there.
And I'm really not trying to hassle you about this. I'm just trying to imagine how this works in the field, because if I'm the decision maker, I'm thinking we need to get some of this carbon out of the air. So let's do that. And just don't do it in a way that's going to have a pipeline blow up or that's going to unduly reward the oil and gas industry. But let's start doing something. What's wrong with that idea?
No, certainly. And that's why we have been focusing so much on nature-based solutions, because we know that they're shovel ready, they're cost effective, then they provide so many co-benefits beyond just removing carbon, right? They provide the adaptation and resilience that we need to the climate that we are living in. And so that is our first and foremost answer to that. If um that we should be incentivizing what we know we can do safely right now, but we do have to lay the groundwork to make sure that the more nascent technologies are able to scale, because we're going to need them, right? There's no doubt.
And I don't think anybody on the Zoom, least of all me, is going to argue with you that the nature-based solutions are preferable. I mean, Mother Earth has been doing this for a long time. But because of man and what we've been doing, Mother Nature's been sort of thwarted, and maybe she can't move the needle enough. So maybe, given the crisis that we have, do we have to move the needle more, even if we risk a little safety issue? Do you
Yeah,
think?
yeah. I mean, there have been numerous studies that are coming out that are demonstrating just that unfortunately, because of this man-made crisis that we're living through, that natural ecosystems are slowing down in the amount of carbon that they're able to draw down. With drought, for example, the rate of carbon sequestration in soils is decreasing because carbon follows water, right? So that is one example in which ecosystems can no longer sequester as much carbon as we thought they could, and that we had originally modeled for them to. So we have to think of these other strategies, but making sure that those strategies don't end up having the same harms to communities in which they're located, like previous industries have.
Well, I'm sure that the Climate Center has its own footprint. And so I always wonder if someone is moved by this discussion of climate policy, how do they get involved with it?
Yeah, with the Climate Center, we have a newsletter that we send out to our subscribers, and that varies in what we're talking about, but it will often promote upcoming events or bills or opportunities to take action. So you can sign up to receive those newsletters and action alerts on our website. And I can drop that link in the chat.
Please. So I think what I'd like to do is turn it over to the audience for questions, if I would. I really appreciate your coming. I know that you're a little apprehensive. I hope I haven't been overbearing about the whole thing, but I like to try to get to the bottom of things in my own little lawyerly way, and I apologize if I overdid it. But if anybody has questions of Baani, I think now would be a good time. Dan, did you have a question?
Well, yeah, I'd like, well, it's an observation more than a question, but 4 years ago, my company, Urban Ore, put 265 solar collectors on the roof of our main building. And it works very well. I just got our latest bill. It used to be $2,400, now it's $28 per month. But the other thing is that those solar collectors get dirty. Our building is located next to a very heavily traveled street in Berkeley. And it's a big building, and the winds come typically from the west. So it hits the building and then it goes over the building. And there's a lot of diesel out there and cars that are waiting. There's a traffic light, they have to wait, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the solar collectors get fouled with carbon. So then we've started hiring a company to come in, and they have a specialized tool that can be adjusted to the distance between the solar collectors. And a guy comes in, sets the whole thing up, and for a price, cleans the solar collectors. Well, what comes off that? What comes off is powdered carbon. And all it does is fall on the roof and get blown away. So that it strikes me that that's a funny one, because it's actually doing what you're wanting to do. It's not at a scalable level at this point, obviously, but it is doing it. And I've seen a video of the little brushes work. They just swirl around. And as they do, they pick up more and more carbon. And down at the end, it all falls off onto the roof. Maybe there's something that could be done to capture that stuff while it's still in that form, because otherwise it just blows out over the city, and I suppose it settles, and maybe that's captured too.
It's an interesting illustration of trying to do something that you think is a good thing, that policy people tell you it's a good thing, but it has a residual problem that wasn't anticipated, at least by you.
Well, it's not a big one as far as finance is concerned, and it's kind of fascinating. That's all. I just think of it as an interesting observation from experience that maybe has some connection to reality.
Well, it's also something that, the automakers for years and years and years have done studies, and they get attacked for this, but they do studies about, well, if we do this kind of little tinker with our engine, we're going to, X number more people are going to get killed than if we didn't do it, which is sort of a macabre kind of way to look at it. But it sounds like a little bit of what Bonnie's talking about is you have to look at the whole picture, and there's always pros and cons. If you have solar collectors on the roof, you're going to have, powdered carbon. And it makes it hard to make a decision about what to do. Mary Lou, you had a question? You're muted, I think.
Unmute, Mary Lou.
There I am. Well, yeah, wanted to riff a little bit on Dan's, precipitated carbon. It seems as though that precipitated carbon, which arises from diesel exhaust and various kinds of vehicle exhaust, there's probably more in it than just carbon. It's not pure carbon. So how much diesel is in that? How much, how much zinc, how much lead, and do we want to bury it? So it seems to me that the testing industry would have a lot of development to do in doing a lot of testing for these alternatives. That you're looking at a lot of alternatives. It sounds like, um, and there would be a lot of testing to do. Are there other Well, I used to be an anti-nuclear activist. Is the nuclear industry dipping its nose through, pushing its nose into the tent here? Does the nuclear industry advocate for itself as a um, carbon solution?
The nuclear industry is not really involved in carbon removal conversations so much. I will say though that the oil and gas industry has really taken a hold and really tainted both CCS as well as carbon dioxide removal, right? They have all these promises to be to have carbon neutral gas. Or I remember Donald Trump
Mm.
on his earlier campaigns talked about clean coal. So as a way of
Oh yeah, that's
reaching the industry to say, let us keep doing what we're doing. We just promise we won't emit any more carbon. So unfortunately, there is that taint to it. However, the science is clear that we do need to be removing carbon out of the atmosphere. And there are, I should say, with CCS, it's not just the oil and gas industry, but there are going to be hard to abate sectors such as cement and steel production, in which CCS could be a reasonable solution.
Does anybody have more questions for Baani? Hearing none. Baani, thank you again for being here tonight. We're going to segue into our next segment, which you're welcome to stay for, and we're going to talk about and honor the late Kathy Evans in our Recycling Archive segment. So, Susan, if you're ready, take it away, and thank you again, Baani.
Thank you,
you,
everyone,
Baani.
so much.
Yeah. So Bonnie Betts, you're going to put up a picture too, right?
Correct.
All right, cool. Well, I want to talk about Kathy Evans. One of my favorite parts of working on the recycling archives is interviewing so many wonderful people who pioneered creating what has become today's ever-changing recycling system. And many of them are friends that I've worked with over several decades, and yet I'm always amazed at how many stories come up in these interviews that I have never heard before. Well, Kathy Evans was someone who I hadn't known before I interviewed her. But after 3 hours of taping a wonderful interview with her up on the upstairs mezzanine at Urban Ore in Berkeley, California, I felt as though we were already great friends. She was just so warm and friendly and told her stories with such ease and humor that I felt as though I'd always known her. There's lots of laughing by both of us on those tapes, and it's fun to listen to. At that time, Dan Knapp of Urban Ore said about Kathy when he was encouraging me to set up an interview with her, she's one of the most authentic of all the recycling pioneers in the sense that she was already at it in 1970 when Earth Day propelled recycling into the international spotlight for good. If anyone can be called a recycling pioneer in the sense of being there at the very beginning, it's Kathy Evans. She worked at the first drop-off center in Berkeley, probably in 1968 or 69. She was a mechanic, a bookkeeper, a head honcho, and a profession full of males. Well, now, actually, Kathy claims she was oblivious to the first Earth Day, and here's how she described it. Nothing in my background was related to recycling. I did spend a lot of time in Berkeley as a student and craftsperson. I graduated in 1969 from the University of California, Berkeley, with a degree in biochemistry. I had a part-time work-study job in the biochem lab because that was my major, and I loved being in the field. I assisted graduate students with their research lab assignments mainly. And otherwise, I was just hanging out in Berkeley when recycling began, making stained glass windows and stained glass trinkets. I was totally oblivious to Earth Day 1970. I don't know where I was or why I missed it, but somehow that event passed me by. So I said to Kathy in our interview, oh, actually, Kathy not only missed Earth Day, but she fell into recycling by accident as well. Now, keep in mind that this was during the Vietnam War, and a lot of men were being drafted into the military to go fight there. And Kathy says, I got connected to recycling because my boyfriend at the time needed a place to do his conscientious objector service, and he had found work at the Ecology Center. Ecology Center started up in 1969, actually, but the directors incorporated it officially on Earth Day. I came into it in 1971. At that time, the Ecology Center was mainly staffed by people who, like my boyfriend, were performing their conscientious objector service. I was hanging around there a lot because of that. Eventually, they needed a bookstore manager, so I became the bookstore manager, which at first was an unpaid position. But not long after that, I got onto the board of directors by write-in, and it was such a newly formed organization that you could do things like that. That's how it all began. Well, I couldn't resist commenting, but you missed Earth Day? And Kathy laughed and said, I did. I've probably never publicly admitted that before, but that's how unenvironmental I was. So now Berkeley's early recycling history is pretty complicated, with several different organizations going their own ways and starting up separate parts of it, and then getting into tiffs with each other before eventually collaborating and then divvying up sharing the pieces of that pie. Kathy was in the midst of all of it. As she tells it, once I became a director at the Ecology Center, I continued at as the bookstore manager. I also worked with others to keep up the Ecology Center's bookkeeping. In fact, a different organization called Ecology Action was doing the actual recycling. And that was a group of activists led by a charismatic leader, Cliff Humphrey. They had landed a federal grant from US EPA to support drop-off centers in Berkeley. So the Ecology Center, where I was, became their grant administrator, and we printed their educational materials. All kinds of politically active people were coming and going through those places. Some of that activism rubbed off on me. I mean, Berkeley was pretty crazy in those days, as she said. At this point, she says, there were 4 groups doing some part of the recycling work, all with completely different goals and interests. This led to 2 years of incredibly intense meetings as we worked on clarifying the relationships. After the EPA funding dried up, the groups lobbied the City Council together, asking for funding to continue recycling and education, including equipment to be provided by the city. One of the new council members declared, I'm not giving all this money to white hippies. Eventually, the different drop-off operations were just kind of falling apart. We were all part-time, poorly paid, and all had our own ideas about what was important in the world. And somehow, Pam Belchamber just pulled everybody together. She formed Community Conservation Centers, or CCC, and from then on, they were the entity that contracted with the city for running the drop-off sites, while the Ecology Center, where I was working, was doing the residual curbside pickups. Now, while Kathy was helping to develop recycling in Berkeley, lots of other California cities around the state were working on getting similar kinds of recycling programs starting in their own areas as well. Kathy had recently been voted onto the board of directors of the new California Resource Recovery Association around that time. She describes how California's recycling development programs got boosted by state support. Kathy says, in 1978, the state announced their first grants from the new litter bill that the state legislature had passed. CCC applied to the state on its own behalf to open a buyback and a processing center. I applied on behalf of Ecology Center to expand the curbside pickup program, and we got both grants. Actually, she says, I think almost everybody on the board of CRA, people with programs all over the state, got some part of that first round of grants. You know how nobody's usually ready to apply for the first round of grants? But there we were, right there with established programs that wanted to grow and needed capital to do it. Well, the next part of our interview went into telling about the early 1980s, a time that is important in Kathy's and Berkeley's recycling history. It's known colloquially as the recycling wars. But it is so complicated and convoluted that I will just tell you that eventually it resulted in defeating a city council plan to build a burn plant, and instead, all the necessary recycling and reuse organizations landed together for the first time onto one transfer station property. Even better, an unexpected and fortuitous opportunity emerged. So Kathy says, north of Berkeley, about 5 miles in the city of El Cerrito, there was a buyback operation funded by an early version of the State Solid Waste Board. Unfortunately, it had become too popular, with too much traffic on the middle-class residential neighborhood street that led to it. So the buyback needed to stop operating. Because the state owned the baling equipment at this buyback, they wanted to transfer it to CCC in Berkeley instead of using a grant to buy it new. The city of Berkeley also made a loan to CCC to cover the difference. And this allowed the buyback, drop-off, and curbside collection systems, which were newly moved together to this new transfer station property, to all feed materials into the same processing facility. So Kathy ended up becoming the manager of both the CCC and the Ecology Center, recycling operations together, a position she held for the next 10 years. It turned out, however, that this fortunate situation with acquiring the baler equipment came kind of with a fly in the ointment. There were many people, both in the city government and in Berkeley's influential political population, who were deeply angry about the recyclers' success and convincing the citizens to vote against building a burn plant and instead in favor of, as their campaign literature urged, giving recycling a chance. Kathy tells that story. The city's Solid Waste Commission, which had on it some of the people who were angry over the burn plant defeat, voted to give the contract to CCC's recycling center to another business, which was a for-profit company of paper brokers. Control of our big fancy baler, nearly new and pretty complicated, was one of their biggest concerns. This took the recycling wars to a new level. The city told CCC to get out of our new recycling site, but we said no. The process was unfair and we won't go. Meanwhile, the city signed a contract with the paper company to operate on our site. Our recycling baler was financed by loans from both the city and the state. So the city and the owner of the paper company got a notion that if they could show we weren't using the state-funded baler, then the city could somehow claim it as their property. They also thought that if we were not in operation, they could get all the state-funded equipment turned over to the city. I wasn't there when the deed got done. I found out right away, though, when I got a call from somebody who told me, Kathy, the city people are taking a part of the baler. It turns out that they came onto the site unauthorized, after hours, accompanied by 2 city employees, someone from the equipment company, and a police officer or 2. The man who called me happened to have been there after hours when the site was locked closed and saw them creeping in. We had been using the baler already, and I didn't know what the city of Berkeley people had done. But I could see where the part was missing in the big electrical panel. We had the plans, so we could look at the plans and identify the part. I called Joel from the El Cerrito buyback, who gave me the number for Roy, the handyman who helped with the equipment. So what do you need? He said when I called him. And I told him what the plan described was missing, and he said, oh yeah, that's the main brain. It was an electrical part that the baler could not run without it. It was an expensive part costing about $1,000. So he went out in the morning after the break-in and got that part and installed it, and the baler was working again right away. But then we learned that at that moment, the city people were at some hearing in Sacramento, the state capital, They were in the process of telling the state recycling staff that CCC was not operating because we didn't have an operational baler anymore. So I called them to say, hey, we are operating, and I held out the phone so they could hear it. I know, it's really hard to believe. It was really nasty, besides being so stupid. Well, even after all of that, the city still persisted in trying to get rid of CCC, even down to no longer allowing them to use the city roll-off trucks they needed to move their drop-off materials to the baler. There were more chess moves, including a bankruptcy, a federal lawsuit, eviction orders, and then a new city council election, accompanied by dueling, passionate op-eds in the newspapers. And hallelujah, the pro-recycling city council candidates won, and Kathy and her colleagues were saved the day before they were to be forcibly evicted. After hearing about all that drama with the baler, I then went on to ask Kathy, well, tell me more about the kind of work you've been doing, especially after all the fury of the recycling wars started to calm down. And Kathy says, oh, I don't know. That's why I'm so burned out now. After all the recycling wars subsided, I was just working like a little devil to keep up with the demand. I was driving trucks. I was fixing trucks. I was managing all those crews. I was also doing the Ecology Center's bookkeeping still. So I was doing a lot of work. I even designed a curbside truck. That was around 1980. I was always doing measurements like recording heights on door jambs. My basic question was, how high can we throw this bundle of newspaper? Now, as an aside, let me tell you to keep in mind that this is from the time when recycling collectors needed to throw the materials into the trucks. There was no automatic pickup. So Kathy continues, another source of information was the Ecology Center office. Trucks would come by daily to deliver beverages and potato chips and convenience items, and I would go out in the street and measure them to figure out what worked for having loads that had different size containers and different weights. And I'm going, oh, that's what we need. That's what we need. Oh, we need something more like that. And I came up with this idea for a truck with a dropped frame that looked right, but then it had to be built, and I didn't know what to do with this idea. It was just a set of drawings on paper. So I looked up some truck body companies in the phone book. The first one I went to said, oh, no, we can't build that plan for you because we can't do all that engineering for just a couple of trucks. It was just luck, but once again, I found someone who was interested, and this was in San Leandro. I just looked him up in the Yellow Pages, and this man, Frank Paletti, was not just nice, but accomplished at his trade with a lot of experience making truck bodies. I walked into his shop unannounced. He's sitting there doing something, and in his shop he had technical people making fire trucks, so he was perfect. He had a business that could tell a customer, sure, if you want a fire truck, we'll make you a fire truck. I was much more bold in those days, and Frank was interested enough in my design to make it real. It's one of those things that you don't realize at the time was a miracle. The truck I visualized would never have happened if I hadn't found somebody like that. So I say to her, so here you were, having gotten a degree in biochemistry, and then you made this huge turn and ended up totally immersed in recycling. And Kathy says, yeah, that's true. Early on, maybe even before high school, I was taking with Jonas Salk. And then came Watson and Crick with their sequencing of DNA. All of that was really exciting to me. I really like science. And then I changed my focus to biochemistry. Somewhere in the back of my mind was the thought that if you do science, you could come up with something that saves the world. And then I found the Ecology Center. And I realized that the work they were doing applied the same principles that I knew from biochemistry. But the principles of ecology work on everything, not just some chemical formulations. In ecology, you have to look at the whole big picture. That larger view was so much more exciting to me than the specialized work I was doing in school. So I said to her, so tell me how you saw that connection. How did recycling manage to work on the same principles? And Kathy says, right from the start, I was using my science training all the time. Science was working for me even in my first job managing the bookstore. That was because we had all these new ideas and findings coming through the store. The science and the results were in the books and the magazines we were ordering and selling. And another thing that was new back then was the Air Quality Act and the Water Quality Act. Everything was brand new. New discoveries, new information never known before. It seemed like science was becoming mainstream suddenly. It was the 1970s, so there was so much going on. Getting into hands-on recycling was life-changing for me because at the Ecology Center, there were so many older people bringing us their materials who'd been through World War II. And they were so happy that they could recycle again. They were really happy with us for providing a way to do what they had done so long ago when it really counted. Because there was so much wrong that you can't do anything about. You can't do much to make your air quality better right around you. It takes big action to make a difference on a big problem, and it's complicated and hard. It's the same with water quality. But with recycling, you could take this piece of newspaper and put it in a bin to get recycled. You could go down to the recycling center and see this great big pile of newspapers and feel like you're helping, making a difference. So I thought it just gave us a way to get the people's hearts and minds active and involved. I loved working in recycling for that. Our whole view of reality was changing. It's funny to me now because we didn't yet have the idea of zero waste, but no waste was what we thought was possible. Our whole goal, even then, was to replace garbage collection with a new system that would handle everything as a resource, not a waste. It was some sort of large, comprehensive resource collection system that we had to build. But then Kathy added ruefully, "It's the only thing that made sense at the time, but now in 2018, it's so frustrating. What recycling had become in almost 50 years doesn't make sense anymore." Well, this interview that I did with Kathy was back in 2018, and she just died of cancer just a few days ago. She was working with CCC right up to the end, although she did have some other priorities in her life as well. When I called her a year after our interview to tell her I wanted to feature her on the ZWAC Show, she said she wouldn't be free to do that for a few months because she was taking care of her kids. I was sympathetic, and we started talking about other dates, and that's when our conversation revealed that when she talked about her kids, she wasn't talking about little people. She had a goat farm, and I was calling during the baby lambing season. I just loved that. I wish I had known her better, but I am so grateful for that wonderful conversation that we spent that afternoon talking for hours about her life. All I can think to say now is, fly free, Kathy. You really did do wonderful things that changed the world. Thank you.
Wow. It is such a gift, Susan, to take portions of a 3-hour interview, pick out the best parts, stitch them together in a compelling story. That is quite a gift. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you. It was a privilege to be able to do it.
Neil, did you have something you wanted to ask Susan?
Yes, first of all, to thank Susan for an incredible rendering of a great story. And I tried to capture this in my comment in the chat, but the essence of her charisma, her interest in things, as well as people, was exactly what she presented to me when I met her back in the mid-70s, also on a government grant to see if recycling could be used as a community development strategy in cities. And of course, meeting Kathy was like a one-stop shopping because if I recall, I could be wrong, she was also involved in the Encore glass washing facility I think outside of Oakland, Emeryville, if I'm not mistaken. And so she was aware of reuse as well as all the other great stories. And excuse me, I had heard from Dan and Mary Lou the story of the baler being being arrested. And your rendition of it was quite wonderful. So thank you, Susan. And I think we're all thankful that we got to know and work with Kathy.
And I'll just add to that, Susan, that I have heard this telling of the recycling war story many a time, and that is by far the best rendition, the clearest rendition I've ever heard. It was a complicated story. Thank you.
It is. Yeah,
I
thank
did,
you.
I did know the reference to the kids, though. Mary Lou, you want to add something?
Well, I just wanted to say that the photo that Bonnie flashed or had, up on the screen of a young Kathy there with, her boxes. Those were waxed cardboard boxes that they colored it. Yeah, there's Kathy. See that smile? She always had it on. She was always looking like that. She could be young, she could be old, she could be in terrible trauma, and she always had that smile. She was just wonderful. She was wonderful to be around. She didn't always get everything done that she promised, and then she would smile at you, and it was okay. She was terrific to be around. She was a visionary and real smart, real well run. She would drive this truck that she says she designed. She would drive one of they were converted beer trucks, and she would drive one on a route. They were diesel. And if a truck broke down, then she would get it back to the processing site, and she would get under the truck. First she drove the truck, then she'd get under the truck, then she'd go in the office and do the books, and it was all one to her. She didn't stand on ceremony. She just was, and she was in a good mood. She was terrific.
That's a good note to end it on, I think. So thank you all for joining the monthly ZWAC show. We do this the second Tuesday of every month, 5:30 sharp. Next month, we're going to go back and start talking about recycling businesses again, and we're going to feature 2 or 3 young recycling businesses that we've interviewed before, and we're going to find out if they made it through the pandemic intact. If they did, how did they do it? How do they feel about facing the coming turmoil that we have, and see what lessons we can learn with that. So I hope you're able to join us next month, and thank you for joining us tonight.